Thank you for joining us for this virtual tour of Fenimore Art Museum's collection of American folk art. Ever since the museum opened in the 1940s, our folk art collection, begun by Stephen C. Clark, has been a central part of what makes the Fenimore unique. In this tour, we will walk you through our main gallery, showcasing artworks from some of the most notable names in American folk art, as well as pieces that highlight the vast breadth of styles, mediums, and stories that folk art has to offer. Stephen Carlton Clark was a philanthropist and art collector whose contributions to American art institutions are immeasurable. He was a trustee of the Metropolitan Museum of Art and a founding trustee of the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. Both of these museums' collections feature key donations by Mr. Clark, including artworks by European artists such as Matisse, Cezanne, and Renoir, and American artists like Thomas Eakins and Winslow Homer. Here in Cooperstown, Mr. Clark founded the Baseball Hall of Fame and the Farmers Museum, and donated his late brother's home to the New York State Historical Association, who turned it into the museum we know today. In the late 1940s, Clark's attention turned to American folk art after the Fenimore's first director, Louis C. Jones, became interested in dedicating a gallery at the museum to such pieces. Clark's investigations soon turned into a tidal wave of new acquisitions, which became the backbone of our extensive folk art collection. What is folk art? The definition is expansive and even somewhat contentious, but in brief, folk art is defined as works created by those who were not formally trained in the fine arts. Principles such as composition, color theory, perspective, light and shadow, and other fundamentals taught in art schools, therefore, may not be a part of a folk artist's visual vocabulary, leading the artwork to look more rudimentary or simplistic by comparison. However, as we will see, this does not mean that every folk artist has received no training, and it certainly doesn't mean that these artworks aren't just as rich and compelling as their fine art counterparts. One of the finest and most recognizable examples of this in our collection is the artwork of Anna Mary Robertson, best known to the world as Grandma Moses. She was born in 1860 and worked and lived on farms her entire life in New York and Virginia with her husband and children. She began painting in her late 70s after her husband had died and her arthritis prevented her from continuing with embroidery. In 1938, an art collector discovered her work in a drugstore window in Hoosick Falls, New York, which he bought for $3 to $5 each. The very next year, 3 of her paintings were displayed at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, bringing her to immediate fame. She created over 1,500 paintings and was celebrated by the public, even having her 100th birthday proclaimed as Grandma Moses Day by New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller. She died in 1961 at 101 years old. Sugaring Off, the painting seen here, is a wonderful example of Moses' style of memory painting, which shines a light on her nostalgic memories of farm life and small-town communities. Like most of her paintings, the view is shown from above so as to allow for as much activity in the scene as possible. In this scene, we can see nearly every step of the process of maple sugaring, collecting sap in buckets, cutting and hauling firewood, boiling the sap into syrup in a large kettle, and even making a special taffy-like treat called jackwax by pouring hot syrup onto fresh snow for an eager group of children. Edward Hicks is another very famous name in American folk art due to his series of paintings titled Peaceable Kingdom. Hicks was born just before the American Revolution into a family with Tory leanings in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. After his mother's death and his father's forced seclusion due to his politics, he was taken in and raised by a Quaker family. In his teens, Hicks apprenticed to a coachmaker and learned the craft of decorative painting. He was later accepted into the Society of Friends and became a highly regarded Quaker minister. But since ministers were not compensated for their work, Hicks continued to paint to earn income. In around 1820, he developed his Peaceable Kingdom formula based on Isaiah 11:6-8 in the Bible, which begins, "The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, and the calf and the lion and the fattened calf together, and a little child shall lead them." He painted variations of this scene over 60 times and mostly gifted them to friends and family. Our museum's collection includes two of these paintings, both showing peaceful animals with large eyes next to angelic children, and in the background, William Penn and fellow Quaker settlers meeting peacefully with the Lenape Indians of the region. Ralph Fasanella was an artist from New York City whose vibrant, jam-packed paintings have become a major part of our folk art collection. Born in the Bronx to Sicilian immigrants in 1914, Ralph helped his father on early morning ice deliveries and would spend time with his mother in the dress shop she worked in. In the painting dress shop, Fasanella removes one wall from the factory his mother worked in to show the process of clothing being made, from the cutting and sewing of patterns, vacuuming loose threads, and pressing creases. Signs on the building and windows refer to major news events during his lifetime, including the assassinations of JFK, RFK, and Martin Luther King Jr., and the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, which led to one of the first 20th century American labor movements. On the left side of the painting is Sullivan Street in the 1920s, where Ralph would travel with his father on his ice delivery route, and on the right side is a more modern Puerto Rican neighborhood. Dress Shop exemplifies Fasanella's somewhat surreal compositions, which span multiple moments in time and celebrate his family, New York City, and the working class. Ralph helped to organize labor unions, and his support and defense of the common man and woman can be seen in many of his paintings, including May Day, a mural-sized work in which a 1930s-era labor march rounds Union Square in New York City and exits into what the artist envisions as a utopian world where the working class is unburdened by the demands of their employers. Playdome, The Kennedy Years, is a very thematically complex work which features everything from corporate higher-ups on an amusement park ride collecting coins from a rocket, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg awaiting execution in a prison cell, members of the working class delivering newspapers, and athletes performing for the pleasure of the upper class. Political and social justice issues would remain the key themes of Ralph's work up through his death in 1997. No discussion of folk art would be complete without exploring the long tradition of portraiture. Before photography became more prevalent in America in the 1850s, middle-class Americans sought out folk art portraitists who could create their likenesses in paint for a week's salary, rather than paying more than a year's salary, which a fine artist's talents would fetch. These works often lack the detail, the shading, and correct proportions one would expect of a fine artist's portraits, but they remain an important record for the family members whose relatives they represent, and a crucial part of American art history. John Brewster Jr. was one such folk artist who would travel to people's homes in New England and eastern New York to create portraits. As a deaf man, he would use writings and rudimentary signs to communicate with his patrons to make sure he incorporated the details they wished to have in their portraits. In 1817, he would become enrolled in the very first class at the first permanent school for deaf Americans in Hartford, Connecticut. Here, in One Shoe Off, Brewster expresses the delicate features and playful innocence of childhood in this portrait of an unknown girl. Traces of red paint visible underneath the paint surface of the bare left foot suggest that the artist placed the red shoe in the child's hand as an afterthought. The patterned floor is an embellishment Brewster often employed in his portraits of children. The stenciled design amusingly mimics the bow of the sitter's right shoe. This stunning 6-foot-tall portrait by artist John Brown depicts Laura Hall of Cheshire, Massachusetts in 1808. She stands in a finely detailed white dress, one hand resting on a Windsor chair and the other clutching a book. The sheer size of the portrait, combined with the woman's jewelry and clothing, reveal that Ms. Brown was from an upper-middle-class household, as does the book she holds, which symbolizes an ability to read due to the tutoring that her family's station in life afforded. Picking Flowers, attributed to the artist Samuel Miller around 1845, is one of Fenimore Art Museum's most adored portraits. This full-length portrait of an unknown girl is vibrantly colored with a bright red dress, a variety of flowers, a dramatic sunset, and a playful kitty at the girl's feet. All of these seemingly joyful elements belie the true nature of this painting, as this is likely meant as a post-mortem portrait for a loved one who had passed away. Patrons would commission folk artists for more than just portraits of family members, however. Artists such as James Bard made a career out of painting incredibly detailed reproductions of marine vessels for their owners and commanders. The mid 1800s was the heyday of passenger steamships on the Hudson River, and owners of these impressive vessels were very proud of them. This ship, the Niagara, traveled between New York City and Albany countless times through the 1840s and 1850s. Albert de Groot, the ship's former commander, commissioned Bard to create this delightful rendition of the Niagara, passing Fort Washington on the Hudson, where the George Washington Bridge exists today. In rural areas such as upstate New York, successful farmers were proud of their agricultural accomplishments, and artists like Fritz Vogt would make architectural portraits of their properties. Vogt immigrated to New York from Germany in 1890 at the age of 50. For the next 10 years, he traveled through the central New York region between Cooperstown and Albany, making delightful pencil drawings of farmers' properties, often in exchange for room and board. In order to include all of the buildings on a property, and even multiple facades of the same building, Vogt's drawings play with perspective in a manner that rivals Cubist painters. Folk art goes well beyond framed artworks, of course, and even spans beyond the decorative into the functional. Wooden bird decoys, stoneware pottery, and tavern and business signs all encompass the world of folk art. Remarkable examples of textiles, including a variety of coverlets and quilts and a wide variety of designs and patterns, are part of the collection as well. Immigrants brought artistic traditions from their homelands to America, such as reversed painting on glass and Scherenschnitte, or decorative paper cutting, and these can be found in our folk art gallery as well. A personal favorite is this interesting item which once resided in a wealthy person's kitchen in the early 1800s. The center of this carved block of wood features two mourners flanking a monument with the inscription in reversed text, "In memory of Washington." George Washington, our nation's first president, died in 1799, and memorials to his life and legacy were common in the decades to follow. This particular memorial takes the form of a cake board, which was used to create an impression on gingerbread dough before it was baked. This impressive painted window screen, made in 1800, is another memorial to Washington, which features a slew of patriotic iconography. An inscribed bust of Washington rests next to the British crown, trampled by the foot of Lady Liberty, who holds a laurel wreath over the late president's head in one hand and an American flag with 13 stars in the other. A bald eagle flies overhead, and behind Lady Liberty are a white pine tree and a Liberty pole and cap, patriotic symbols obscure to us today, but very common 200 years ago. Folk art has had a direct connection with American politics over the years. One grand example in our collection is this massive banner painted by Terence Kennedy in 1836, which was carried in parades in support of the Whig Party. Surrounding the eagle and shield in the center of the frame are images representing the key policies the Whig Party endorsed: industry, agriculture, and infrastructure. The Erie Canal system, modern steamships, and railroads are central elements seen on the banner. Many pieces in our folk art collection celebrate African American art, heroes, and culture. Here are just two examples. This beautiful portrait, created by white abolitionist William Matthew Pryor in 1845, represents William Whipper, a self-educated son of a white lumber merchant and black house servant. He wrote influential addresses on nonviolent protest against slavery and used funds from his successful business ventures to aid fugitive slaves on their passage north. Clementine Hunter was a descendant of slaves who became one of the most celebrated folk artists of the 20th century. Like Grandma Moses, her style of memory painting looks back on scenes of black Southern life in the Cane River Valley of Louisiana. This painting, Ladies Playing Cards, from 1968, is emblematic of her style. Clementine was featured in Look magazine in the 1950s and created well over 5,000 paintings during her lifetime. Fenimore Art Museum continues to collect important and striking examples of American folk art to this day. In 2014, our museum acquired this incredible shoeshine stand owned and decorated by Sicilian immigrant Giovanni Indelicato. Giovanni, a former bootblack in Manhattan, decorated this shoeshine box, stool, chair, and footrests with an array of beads, jewelry, metal studs, and ceramic figurines. The important modern artist and sculptor Louise Nevelson discovered his work in 1942 and presented his shoeshine stand to the Museum of Modern Art, stating that the piece was, quote, subconscious surrealist art. It is an epic of Mediterranean culture, unquote. The museum displayed it in its lobby during the Christmas season, but never purchased it for its collection. It was feared lost until it reappeared at a New Jersey auction house in 2014, where it was purchased by a local antique dealer who in turn sold it to Fenimore Art Museum despite a higher offer from a private collector, stating that she believed such a masterpiece belongs in a museum. We hope you enjoyed this exploration of our main gallery at Fenimore Art Museum. But of course, this virtual tour only scratches the surface of what our extensive American folk art collections have to offer. Our curatorial team rotates the artworks featured in our gallery on a regular basis, so every time you come to the museum, you will likely see something new. You can also browse a portion of our folk art collection, as well as our fine art collection and thaw collection of American Indian art, at our website, fenimoreart.org. Now, stay tuned for a live question and answer session.